You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your very literal host, Abraham.
And I'm your non-visual host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and the things that people imagine that they can do and your mind, generally, sort of, kind of.
Yeah, we're back to mind things. Ooh,
that's
scary,
right.
Scary, spooky.
And this week, we are actually re-releasing a previous episode on aphantasia, thinking without pictures.
Yeah, which is a thing that when it was described to me that this is a thing that people experience, I did not understand how this can happen because I have a very vivid imagination.
Yes, and we'll unpack that as we replay this original episode, which aired November 8th, 2017, 6 years and some months ago. Like, wow, it's been a while.
It's been a long time. A lot's happened in 6 years.
Yeah, so this was, I think, Shane, before you joined the podcast, I think this was,
Yeah, this was BCS. So this was that time.
Before changing to Shane.
Yeah, before changing to Shane. It was a while ago. I mean, I think I was kind of supporting, but I wasn't doing a lot of work on the show proper. So
that sounds about right. Yeah.
That didn't come until later.
Okay. So we are going to play the episode in its entirety, and then we are going to, after we've played that, we're going to come back and do a little bit of a follow-up discussion and just some more sort of unpacking. And this one, it's been on my mind because this came up somewhat recently on some other podcasts, because since we released this, there has just continued to be a flurry of like new people talking about this and doing research on this. And I think, we are going to come at this from a sort of skeptical perspective and also a pragmatic perspective.
Sure.
And at the same time, acknowledge that, like, always wanting to be sensitive to communities who have whatever experiences that they have, and like everyone's entitled to think and feel what they think and feel, and they don't need our permission for that. But
yeah,
anyway, if you're listening to this on the day that it releases, I would like to wish you a happy Coconut Torte Day.
That sounds delicious. It's also Donald Duck Day, which I'm a big fan of. He's my favorite Disney character.
And to be clear, we're also talking about the day that this rerun releases, not that this is not November 8th date holidays. This is March 13th date holidays.
Right.
It is Earmuff Day, which, I mean, it started to get to be spring in most places, so I'm not sure, but maybe in Canada, I don't know.
Yeah, unless that's specific to profanity and not using it.
Yeah.
So
sure.
It could be either one of those. It's Good Samaritan Involvement Day, which I like. Be a good community member.
It's L. Ron Hubbard Day, so go check out our Scientology allegedly episode.
Yeah. Also, a real good example of a not good Samaritan. L. Ron Hubbard, that man. It's National Jewel Day, so go play all of her records. I think it's actually specific to, precious stones, but it's fun to think that it's about Jewel herself.
Right. National Open an Umbrella Indoors Day, tempting the bad luck gods.
Isn't it weird that there's like a superstitious day in the middle of March?
It is kind of strange.
It feels weird.
I'd be interested to unpack that more, but for now, we're just saying what it is.
I'd love to open that umbrella there. It's a Smart and Sexy Day, which means it's my birthday. Ha 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 ha. No. My birthday's in
it is Brain
kidding.
Awareness Week. In case you didn't know, you have a brain.
Surprise! Many of you probably wish you didn't. It's Girl Scout Week.
It is also National Green Week. Drink those green smoothies.
Yeah, I love it. Spinach in your smoothies. It's also National Sleep Awareness Week, which now you're aware that you sleep sometimes.
And Patient Safety Awareness Week. We should make sure our patients are safe.
I love that. It's also Sunshine Week, which is every week in Florida, but some places maybe not so much. And
it's Ramadan. So if you celebrate, happy Ramadan.
Yeah.
Or maybe not happy. Some of those celebrations are meant to be more suffering than not. I don't know. Depending, I guess. I hope your Ramadan goes well. As
I hope your Ramadan is successful in its goals for you.
We're actually not going to talk any more about any of those holidays. We are instead going to turn to the topic at hand, which is aphantasia, this idea of thinking but without visual imagery and what that could possibly mean. So let's go ahead and get to that episode, and then we will come back with a follow-up.
Hey there, this is Abraham, your host.
And your co-host, Ryan O.
And so this is why we do what we do. So, Ryan, before we start, as we start, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine something, okay?
Okay. This was not planned for listeners.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I just want you to think about something, close your eyes, and I want you just to think about something, think about your house, okay? All right, so are you thinking about your house?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I want you to just describe it to me as best you can.
It's tan. It's a part of a couple other houses. Like they're all kind of next to each other. It's like this old 70s development. Kind of pretty clean, maintained outside. I can see the door-ish.
Okay.
To the gate that gets me in. And then I walk the same path all the time. So I guess there's two paths, either to my door, because I have an external door to the house, or to the garage to kind of go through that way.
Can you see if there's any like dirt smudges on the walls?
There's a tree next to it. There's another bush that I have to like duck to be able to get by because I'm kind of tall to get to the front door. The concrete's kind of rough. I remember that, like walking up to it, and there's a ledge to step into the main gate.
Can you imagine hearing the squeak as you like open the door?
No, I can imagine hearing like when I pull the little gate opener handle, because it's like latched on the inside. I can kind of imagine that sound. But again, I've heard that every day for the last 3 years, at least once a day.
Sure. Okay, so now keep your eyes closed. I'm going to confirm for our listeners that your eyes are in fact closed. And so now I want you to try and imagine a monster. It's nothing you've ever seen before. Try and think of something brand new you've never seen, and just describe whatever you come up with.
Okay, so I see like 6 eyes on this weird, I don't know, like I'm trying to make up an alien, but I don't know how to make up an alien.
That's okay.
I've never been creative. So there's like, I'm going to say I'm just going to make it up. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got 6 eyes because 6 sounds cool. And it's got talons. It makes sounds like the Predator because that's scary. And everyone can relate to it.
That's great.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I could choose. Like, is it scaly? Is it slimy?
Right.
I've never contacted these things.
All right, you can open your eyes.
Okay.
All right. So
where were we going with this?
Well, I just wanted to just have you describe your experience with it. Now, as you had your eyes closed, were you actually seeing something as you were describing it?
No, I mean, like I feel like it's a little bit easier to, I use air quotes here, see the first thing I described versus in the second.
Okay.
But I feel like I'm kind of biased as to like where I'm going to fall in this topic since I researched it too.
Yeah, no, I understand. But were you, with your eyes closed, were there like images on the back of your eyelids that you were actually looking at, like pictures?
Definitely not.
Okay. So a lot of people, when asked to imagine or put in a situation where they have to pretend to experience something, it can be noises, or most of the time it's images, but it can be like feeling on their skin. It can be smells, all those sorts of things. There are some people who report that they can't. They just have no experience whatsoever when they're trying to visualize these things. Okay. And so those people who experience this have been described as having what's called aphantasia, and not to be confused with Disney's Fantasia or Fantasia 2000.
Boom.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so what is this thing?
Yeah, so it sounds like the opposite of what Temple Grandin likes to talk about a lot, right?
Yeah.
And has like largely built her career off of, at least on one of her branding aspects of like how she interprets the world and how she like solves and creates solutions, right?
Yeah,
like
totally.
This would devastate her, I don't know, perspective and like how did she potentially function, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah, if she had aphantasia?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and so what this refers to, so it's Greek, so it means no imagination. And it really is just these people who they can't visualize mental images in their mind's eye. They can't imagine sensations. Well, it depends on different people have different types of experiences. Like they might be able to imagine sound, but they can't visualize a picture in their mind's eye. And so it's kind of interesting because this is a pretty new thing, although it does have a longer-ish past. So what I saw, and I think you found something a little bit different in your notes, but what I saw was that this was really first described in 2015. And so that was very recently, at the time of this recording, it's 2017. So only a few years, a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of there's rebrands and things like that, right? And like, I'm sure this isn't something, when I first read your notes in 2015, I was like, there's no way like it was in 2015. But then I thought about it more and I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like someone labeled it, or maybe it was relabeled because we see those things. We actually just recorded and should have released a podcast episode on the kind of the restructuring of Asperger's syndrome, right? And how these things can kind of shift. So I was like, okay, maybe that's what it was. But still, when I looked back, I saw some evidence that Sir Francis Galton in 1880 had a survey that suggested that it may only be true for about 2.5% of the population that they experience these sort of lack of or inability to visualize things.
And I don't think they had a name for it, at least not the one that they currently have. So it was first described by, I want to say Adam Zeman. That's how I'm going to pronounce it.
Yeah, let's go with Zeman.
Zeman. And so he's a cognitive neurologist at the University of Exeter Medical School. Oh, I'm saying that correctly. Exeter?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it sounds like.
Yeah. And yeah, so he discovered, or he heard about these cases of people who could not visualize. And so he started to do some research and explore this and, try and figure out how he could sort of describe this in a scientific way.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, but it immediately, when I first heard about this, raised the question for me. I'm thinking, how do you know? Like, if someone else they tell you that, they can't visualize, how would you know that they can't visualize? Like, I'm thinking of my own. I'm like, okay, I can imagine something that is, I would imagine seeing something, even though I'm not actually seeing it. But I don't know how someone else would be able to look and tell whether or not I was actually visualizing it. So I was really curious. And so I obviously wanted to look and see, how are they testing this, right? And what I found was that the first one, and there's some new research now, but the first one was pretty subjective. It was this visual imagery questionnaire, actually called the Vivid Visual Imagery Questionnaire, or the VVIQ. And the purpose of this thing is to basically, it asks the person to rate how vivid their mental image is of something. And so I actually have a couple of questions from the questionnaire itself. And so it's ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is perfectly clear, as vivid as you were looking at a picture. And then 5 is no image at all. You just know that you're thinking of whatever it is you're supposed to be thinking of.
Okay.
And then the first thing on here is, think of some relative or friend whom you frequently see but is not with you. Carefully consider the picture that comes to your mind, and then rate the following items: the exact contours of their face, head, shoulders, and body, characteristic poses of head, attitudes of body, precise carriage, length of step. So I guess you're also imagining them moving. And then the different colors worn in some clothes that you commonly see them in. And then it goes on and asks about other things. It has the rising sun, a store that you go to frequently. And you just go through and you rate each one of these items from 1 to 5. 1, you can see it really well, and 5, you can't. And that was the initial one. And so
I saw a video of this, actually.
Oh, did you?
Snippet.
Oh,
There's
cool.
a very little bit of a snippet.
Describe
I believe it was Zeman. He was asking the sunset question to somebody. And I mean, this was like a highlight reel, like 3-second snippet.
Okay.
I didn't see anything really of substance. But yeah, I believe it went from 0 to 60 is what they said was the score that I saw.
Oh, okay. Like you could get 0. Wait, how would you get 0 if you could rate 1 on everything?
There was some sort of aggregate score that like went from 0 to 60, I believe.
It looks like you'd have to be able to at least give a score of 16. If you give a score of 1 on every item, or a 5. Oh, I get it. Never mind.
Okay. And wherever the gentleman was that was like a part of it fell just a little below the average, but around the median, it sounded like.
Okay.
Like one of the most frequently answered ones.
Okay.
So where do we want to jump into?
Well, I think that we should just basically describe, okay, so we have this questionnaire. This might be a reasonable way of investigating this, but we also know that this has got some limitations to it. And I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the basic question of, if you close your eyes, and I asked you this when we first started, do you actually see anything? Is there a picture there for you? No. You're shaking your head no. And there's not one for me either. And really anybody, there's not an actual image that they see. You are sort of imagining something, or you're recalling it, or you just
that old copy theory.
Yeah. And so and it makes perfect sense. Your eyes are not receiving any visual information. You're not like getting photons that are hitting your retinas that are allowing you to see anything. And so, you couldn't possibly be seeing anything, if your eyes are closed, right? And so even if your eyes are open and you are seeing things, is that different? Like, how would you know? You'd be seeing something, but you would be seeing whatever was in front of you, and you might be thinking about something else. But does that mean that you're actually seeing a picture of it? No. And so that's one of the things that comes to mind with this when I'm thinking of this questionnaire is like, okay, if you ask me to rate like as perfectly clear as a picture, as is the first one, perfectly clear and as vivid as normal vision, and I have my eyes closed or they're open, under no circumstances am I ever going to say yes. And even though there are things that I think that I can imagine very vividly, right? Even things I can imagine what it feels like to be in a situation where I'm sad. I can imagine what it feels like to get a shot in my arm from like, a vaccine or something.
Yeah.
Like I know what those things feel like and I can imagine what it feels like, but it's not as clear as the event itself.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe I'm part of this population of people who can't sense things, but my guess is, and basically what I've sort of interpreted from what I was reading from other people is that most people aren't going to hit one very often. People will have a range of scores where it can be very clear, but not perfectly clear, which begs why even have that option if it's never going to be there,
Maybe you don't have the gene for it.
Yeah, that could be it. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Because I have some notes on that.
That sure was a great point, I think. Let's get to some ads. And we're back.
Another thing I was thinking about is if someone can describe anything in terms of its visual characteristics. So describe to me your car using just like observable features.
So it's black with blue license plates that say Nevada. The license plates are Ryan O. Surprise, surprise. Now you can find and track me anywhere in Nevada, by the way.
Although you could probably do that just by watching your social media.
Yes. As for, I don't know, there's a crack in the windshield. I just got it a couple days ago.
All right. Now, so you're just talking about the visual aspects, but how can I tell if I'm, looking at this, whether or not you're describing a mental image or you're just describing the visual descriptions of the thing, even though you're not seeing it right now?
Aren't those the same thing?
I don't know. It seems like they sort of are, right?
Yeah.
And so
I don't know.
I'm having a hard time telling the difference. And so again, I'm not trying to comment on this phenomenon. I'm really looking at this as a method for testing that phenomenon, because what I did is I asked you to just describe what you see, and you could probably come up with vivid details. And even that the alien thing that's not even real you were describing, you came up with 6 eyes. You could probably describe the eyes as being glossy and small, and even give precise measurements for how large they are.
Yeah.
And all of those things are not, you're not seeing a perfect image. You are just describing visual elements of a thing. Something else I thought was pretty interesting is thinking about just considering people who are born blind and never see anything, or maybe born deaf and never hear anything. So going to the other types of senses that you might try and imagine.
Yeah. Those are often also described as overpowering, or they overcompensate, I guess.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Or compensate because of. I don't know if over was the best word.
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. It makes me wonder, though, if someone who is either born blind or born deaf or born without one of those other senses, if they also struggle with imagining or visualizing. If I had a friend in high school and he was born blind, he had never seen anything his entire life. It wasn't even like the kind of blindness where you can see a little bit. It was absolutely nothing whatsoever.
Darkness, huh?
Just darkness, right? Although to him it wasn't darkness, it was just normal. It just wasn't a sense he had. And I had the idea one time to try and describe to him what blue looked like. And it was just there was nothing you could say. Yeah, I mean, because it only has visual characteristics. I could say it's a lightish color, but he doesn't know what light colors look like. I couldn't say it's a darkish color. He doesn't know what dark looks like.
Yeah.
And so there was nothing I could do to try and describe to him what this thing looked like. And so it makes me wonder if people who are born visually impaired to the point where they've never seen anything and they also can't visualize things, would those also be described as people having aphantasia? Or belonging to that community of people that are described as aphantasics. Is it aphantasics, do you think?
I do not know.
Okay, I'm just gonna say having aphantasia then. Okay, and so that makes me think that this is not necessarily mental representations. It has to do then just with the eyes. You know what I mean? Because if they can't visualize something, but then that has to do with their eyes, and the other person can't visualize something, but it also has to do with the visual. I don't know. It just makes me think that it has to be one of those two things. And I don't know. Maybe it's the other way around. What do you think?
So it sounds like to me, I would definitely go with the eyes.
Okay. That's what I thought, and maybe there's a logic in the other way. But it just seems like it has to do with the eyes, if that would be the case. And maybe the same thing for someone who's born
and we
deaf.
talk a lot about all variables are relevant, right? In these sort of things. But there's definitely still a mechanism sometimes of kind of a key part. And man, it sure seems like the eyes are important here.
It does. I mean, we're talking about if you're trying to imagine something visually, you then have to know what it means what visual means. You have to know what those stimuli are. And another one I was thinking about, and just again, coming back to this questionnaire itself, is what if someone is just very literal in their interpretation? And I mean, you say, I want you to visualize your house. And you're like, I don't know what that means. Like, I don't see a picture when I close my eyes. What's wrong with me? And it's like, well, nothing. It's that I don't mean that you're actually going to see a picture. I mean, just tell me the visual descriptors of your house.
Do the best you can.
Yeah. If I showed you a picture of your house, would you recognize it? You know what I mean? And so that's more, I think, what I worry about with this type of questionnaire is that you don't know how people are interpreting those questions, especially when it comes to language. These questionnaires that are based just on language and having you try to respond to the question, how the question is phrased is critically important to how it's interpreted. And even then, not everyone's going to interpret the questions the same way. Yeah.
And our good old buddy Israel Golddiamond showed that in the 60s very well, and that you could essentially set it up to get your answer however you'd like.
Yeah, good old Golddiamond coming back. And that's a problem inherent in questionnaires in a lot of different settings, and that sometimes it's something you can get around, sometimes it's not. Another question I had is, part of this is not necessarily how well you can visualize the image. It's mostly how well can you answer my question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I said, imagine the alien, you only gave me a few characteristics. You didn't really give me a whole lot of detail about it.
I'm not creative in that sense of just picking up things like that.
Well, but I mean, it does. It comes down to this. It's not necessarily are you visualizing it, it's are you answering my question in such a way that I can believe you're visualizing it.
Yep.
And maybe you even believe that you're visualizing it, or maybe you believe that you're not.
Yeah.
And there's no way that either of us would be able to tell in that case because it's just asking a question.
So I also found this, like, I dove into YouTube. I'm all up into that realm the last couple of years.
That makes sense.
So I'm going through an excursion, and kind of led me to this video on using a memory palace as an aid for people who have experienced these things that are called apparently aphantasia or aphantasia-like.
Okay.
So I thought that was pretty interesting since we released an episode of the Memory Palace, and someone's out there saying like, hey, there's this thing, but you can actually like overcome it or try to overcome it. And it was, I guess it stood out because I didn't find a lot of that. I found a lot of people like being supportive and relating to being able to not see in pictures.
Right.
But it was one of the pieces of information and one of the few that I found that was actually like trying to look at it from a different perspective.
That's super interesting. So it was like a how-to to try and improve your condition?
Kind of, yeah. And it looked like one of those things that was probably a more well put together college level project or something.
Did you see if anybody like reported that they had that experience of having their condition improved?
No, I did not. I
wonder if that was in the comments.
I don't dig in the YouTube comments, mainly because a lot of the YouTube comments just aren't good.
Yeah.
The people I follow, so I should have.
I had that experience myself.
Yeah. So anyhow, it was a different perspective that didn't seem to be of the majority.
That's pretty interesting. I'd like to look at that.
Yeah.
And I might even take the plunge and look at the YouTube comments and see if anybody reported that it worked for them. I'd be very curious about that. So this is probably something we'll want to cover at a later time, but there are those who are resistant to treatment of things like this because they see it as part of their identity and like, don't try and take this away from me.
Yeah.
And
cool. Totally respect it.
Sure. Yeah. And that's your thing. Then that's your thing. That's fine.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about the questionnaire and gave a lot of ideas about where some of the limitations are with that questionnaire. I think that initially trying to look at this phenomenon, it makes a lot of sense to say, okay, how prevalent is this? What are people experiencing? And then this is the quickest, easiest way to sort of go down that path and ask that question. And so it is what it is. And obviously they want to say, we aren't the only ones who've ever recognized that there's some limitations with this. Obviously the people who are doing research on this, especially for a career, and they have a lot of lines of research that they're pursuing in this, they wanted something better. Yeah. And interestingly, what came out of people who were interested in this was sort of turning to the perception research. And, they recognized that there was this problem of subjectivity. And in perception research, although they still rely on people responding to questions often or sort of giving their own reaction to things, of which I have a very funny story I'll tell after this.
Okay.
It is at least a lot more systematic in terms of how you can observe someone's response to something, and then you can measure it a little bit more precisely. And so specifically, they turned to this idea of what's called binocular rivalry.
Okay.
And the way that this works, I tried this test on myself, and I didn't have the right equipment to make it work appropriately. But the way that it works is that there are two images, and they're presented to each eye separately. So a lot of times we'll have people wear like goggles, and specifically the images can't be received by both eyes. And the most common one that's used apparently is where there's an image that is like red over top an image that is blue. And then they'll be wearing goggles over one eye that's red and over the other eye that's blue. And then they look at this image with some kind of like divider or something.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And what happens is that they are only able to see one of the images, and it might go back and forth between them, but mostly one of the images will stick, and then that's the one that they'll see.
Okay.
And so, okay, cool. So that's interesting. Why is that related to aphantasia? Well, what is interesting about this is that they can prime people to see one of those images by like saying something like, I want you to think of the color blue, or something about the color that they want them to focus on. And then what happened is if they said, okay, I want you to think of the color blue, and then showed them the two images, about 60 to 95% of people, which is a huge range, but 60 to 95% of people would see the blue. They would see the one that they were primed to see.
Okay.
Okay. But what happened then is that for people who were described as having aphantasia, if they were primed the same way of, I want you to see the color blue, or be thinking about the color blue, or whatever the prime was, and then shown the image, only about half of them saw the blue image, which is basically chance.
Yeah.
Then half of them saw red.
That's the first thing I thought of. Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly. And so this is the most objective way of looking at this in terms of, if we were to prime this and this wasn't a real thing, then we should expect that everybody should see about the same rate, regardless of whether or not they have this aphantasia.
Yeah.
And what they saw was that it was different. Like they had fewer people who were able to see the one that was primed, at the point where it could have just been a shot in the dark,
Yeah.
And unprimed. And I actually don't remember if in the research that I looked at, whether or not they saw that people were 50-50 if it was unprimed. That would be a really important piece of this. But unprimed, I think that it was 50-50, and primed, it was higher than that.
Okay. So if I understand you right, this perception angle of this perception research, it allows us to kind of rule out some of the subjectivity, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was the goal, I think.
Yeah. But you're still having to like self-report.
Yeah, there is some self-report.
So it moves us out of this mental world a little bit, but it houses us still in this visual world, which helps, right?
Yeah. So it makes me, I was thinking about this, and that it's good because it eliminates this, how do you interpret my questions? It eliminates this, like, how vividly are you seeing this? And it really gets more at this angle of just, is my language having an effect on the way that you visually perceive things? And that's what it seems to be doing. And that is a lot more objective in what people see, because presumably they should only see one image. And if the only image they see is the one that was primed, or the only image they see is a random chance, then that tells you how well that prime worked for that person.
Yeah.
There is a lot more objective than just saying, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you see this imaginary picture? You know what I mean? And so, yes, there is still that self-report thing. And another is that the link between the prime and aphantasia it's actually not necessarily related, And what I mean by that is, just because they see this correlation between the prime and the 50-50 shot, that doesn't actually necessarily have anything to do with their being able to imagine things visually. That really just does, how well are you reacting to my prime on this visual test? And so what you might be able to, I guess, derive from this is that what you can say is these people are not easily influenced by language to be receptive to at least these types of perceptive tasks, if not failing to be influenced in other ways as well. And it also makes me really curious about these people. Like, I wonder if these are people, if they're not susceptible to this language task, and they're not susceptible to these kind of instructions to visualize things as well as other people, if they'd be really difficult to hypnotize. And again, this comes back to the idea that this is more of this sort of verbal task, where it's, how well do you understand me?
Yeah.
And how well is my language influencing you?
Yeah.
And you're not necessarily seeing how well are you imagining something, because you are actually having them look at something directly.
Yeah. I'd be curious if people with more expansive vocabularies could imagine.
Oh, that's a really
these
cool
sort of things
question.
more, right?
Oh, I like that a lot.
One thing Abraham has on me all day, every day, is an extremely expansive vocabulary. There's not an hour that I hang out with him that I don't have to ask him to define like 1 to 6 words. And I'm jealous I don't put in the time there. But I'd be curious. Like,
it allows me to do very well at word games.
Yes. Yes. I'm curious if you have a more vivid memory than I do as a result.
Man, that's a really cool question. I don't know. I kind of want to test it now.
Haven't looked it up.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know no data. Sorry, that was unclear. I have not looked that up, so I don't know.
Yeah. If anyone out there is doing this, let us know because I'm very curious.
Hit us up in the comments, DMs, email, or phone.
Yeah. All those things.
I love the things that you say here, but let's go to some ads. And we're back.
Okay, so let's go and move on to how common is this? And I think we actually maybe mentioned before.
Yeah, so we actually found a prevalence rate of between 1.5% and 3%.
So that's kind of a lot.
Yeah.
Like that's actually like a lot of people.
3% of 7.5 billion.
Right.
That's like where we're at, right? It's not even like I can't even imagine how many people that really is.
Yeah,
that's beyond the realm of
we're talking about.
Things.
I mean, that would be every single person in New York City.
Yeah, that would be up to 225 million people.
Whoa, that's a lot of people.
That's insane.
Yeah, maybe that's pretty accurate. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, just to put that in perspective, I guess that's 225 million people potentially.
Well,
or a minimum of 125 million people in the world that experience this.
Yeah. All right. We've kind of described what the tests were and what this is and some of the considerations around that test, but there's more on top of this in terms of just the overall concept of what this is and some of the controversy and implications that have arisen as a result of this. And this is very new, so there's still a lot to know. So one of the implications of this is that it seems to suggest that people who have trouble visualizing also wouldn't necessarily be able to remember all that well. And I asked you about your car, but if I asked someone who was actually described as having aphantasia to describe the car that they drive or the house they live in, and they could tell me like the make, model, and color of their car, they could tell me their house and maybe even the color of the front door and some things inside the house and all of that. And then I say, okay, now I want you to visualize that your house, and they're all of a sudden unable to do that. That would be really weird to me, I guess. So I don't know exactly how that's fundamentally different by them being able to describe it visually as being able to imagine it visually. At least it seems like I can't tell what the difference would be there, you know?
Yeah. So you're saying it's hard to hard to understand that why they can do one but not the other?
Yeah.
Like they can visualize and describe it in the moment, but they can't do it later?
They can describe the visual aspects of it, but they say that they can't visualize it itself.
Yeah.
And so again, this makes me think that asking them to just describe the details is different from them actually saying that they have the experience of visualizing it. And at least that's their experience with it, even though like we're sort of implying the same thing. All
right. So this kind of sounds like something else, like pretending.
Well, yeah, that was another thing that I was thinking about this is it more than anything else we're talking about. I want you to imagine that you feel something or imagine that you hear something or imagine that you smell something. All these things is that you're really asking someone to act as if something is present that isn't present. Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's asking them to just pretend. If you cannot act as if something is not present, then that would be what people are describing as aphantasia. But it has all these other implications with it.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that these people who are described as having aphantasia, they're actually no less good at creative tasks, at logical tasks, at problem solving.
Interesting.
They are creative. They can remember things. They have no problems with their memories. They do not actually lack imagination in the things that they do, and they can think of things that aren't there. They can describe things that they remember. They can write music. They can write poetry. There's, and I mean, 225 million. That's a lot of people that would be pretty inhibited by this if that were the implication that they also can't act as if something wasn't really present, which is largely what verbal behavior is anyway. And so all of this requires this thinking and executive functioning in the brain.
This whole Aphantasia and Fantasia Disney reference actually like made me think we should probably kick this episode to people like that to see if there's anyone in that realm.
Yeah,
right?
I would actually love
anyone
that.
in that design and creative process, like that's the idea, right? Is like you can visualize and see these things and you put them on paper.
Yeah. Maybe it's 3% of the population that's not an aphantasia.
Yeah. Sorry for the side rant. I'm just kind of connecting things over here and thinking.
That's totally cool. And something else I found was someone describing this is, and this is, I think this is an important point, is that imagery is not actually pictorial. And that is to say that when we say that we're thinking of something visually, or I'm telling you to imagine something and you can describe what it looks like, you're not actually seeing any images. You're not seeing any pictures.
What are we seeing? Because I feel like I see pictures. Could be the argument, right?
Yeah. And maybe it could be, is what you're, again, it's basically pretending. You are acting as if you are seeing a picture. And so there's this test that I saw that I kind of liked. So first, if I show you a picture of a tiger, and you have so this picture is right in front of you. Okay.
Mhm.
With the picture that you're actually looking at, could you count the stripes?
If I was actually looking at it?
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. Now, if I ask you to imagine a tiger, I want you to imagine counting the stripes on the tiger.
Is that because you just primed the answer?
Maybe.
I feel like I'd have a difficult time. I'd be doing things like I did with the alien, like, it's got 6 eyes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could kind of make up how many stripes could be there, but they could also change as you're imagining it.
Yeah.
Because when you're imagining things, you're doing so verbally because I asked you to do it. And so what you're doing is you're using your understanding of that language to create what your language would describe as being that visual imagery. And so you then can sort of make up what that would be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's real. And another one that I've done that I think is kind of fun is that I'll ask someone to like, all right, if you look at your name in writing, all right, so you look at your name.
Looking at my name on my phone.
What's the second to last letter?
N.
Perfect. All right, close your eyes. I want you to visualize your last name.
Okay.
Okay. What's the fourth letter?
Does an apostrophe count as a letter? N?
Okay.
I'm just messing with you.
Yeah. Okay. So
that took a little bit.
yeah, it's difficult because you're not actually looking at a picture of it. If you're looking at a picture of a word, I can easily ask you to rattle off the letters. You can do that. But when you're trying to imagine visually, it's much more difficult, even for people who do not, label themselves as having difficulty visualizing things.
Yeah.
And so these aren't really visual tasks. They're verbal tasks. It's really important to state at this point. So we've basically been talking about what is difficult about this and how to understand it and how to measure it and what's going on with this. And I really want to point out here, and I've tried to say this a couple times now, is that I'm not saying that people might not be experiencing something here. Of course they are. They're experiencing something, and they're experiencing something that they believe to be different from what other people are experiencing.
Okay? I would totally agree with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
I don't want to discount because, again, I don't know whether you're able to imagine something or visualize it. And at the same time, I don't know that someone isn't able to do that, and so I can't say that they are or not having this experience. I have to believe that they are. It makes sense that they're able to report on it. Then something's going on for them.
Scientific standpoint, I think, yes, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just moving on with a couple more of these implications, especially of the research of this. So there are quite a few studies. There's some neurology studies. There's some of these more cognitive task studies that involve that questionnaire, and a bunch of people who've tried to ask this question a bunch of different ways. And one of the limitations I saw in these studies is that every single one that I saw was a group design that had about 7 people. I did see up to 15, and I think I saw one that was as high as about 20.
So even not being from that world, I know that's extremely low.
Yeah.
Like I'm very into single subject design, a very different approach.
Right.
And still.
Yeah, and group design, that's how most psychological research is done. And so in order to be able to test for statistical significance, you have to have a few hundred people to really have a good sample size. And 100 can work, but 7, like that's very low. And there is, I want to point out, because this is affecting a relatively low percentage of the population, even if you're at like a university setting, you don't have a really large pool to draw from.
Yeah.
That could be one of the reasons it's difficult to get a lot of participants in here.
Yeah. I mean, it's even relatively new with it being coined. So
yeah, great point.
Interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, so awareness of this is still pretty low. And so it's difficult to do this kind of research. But just saying that if you look at those studies, having populations that are that small in the group design makes it very difficult to derive any meaningful statistical significance from that. So, okay. Another implication I was thinking about with this is if someone had aphantasia and they weren't able to visualize something. Okay. And again, saying that is
100% valid.
Yeah, 100% valid. So I'm saying that you might have aphantasia. Wouldn't that imply that if I were to describe something to you and then you saw it, it'd be like, whoa, I had no idea what that looked like.
Yeah.
Like everything that I described to you that you hadn't seen or experienced before would be like a huge surprise. And it seems just like, if I were to say, oh, I drive this red car that is a 4-door Hummer. And then I went outside and there was a 4-door Hummer and I went in. They're just like, whoa, I had no idea this is the kind of car you drove.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay. It seems like that would be an implication of you wouldn't be able to imagine what that would look like. So everything that you saw would be a surprise. Or if I were to describe what something sounded like, it'd be the same thing. Like there's this music, it's very gravelly and grating. And then you listen to it and you're like, man, that was not at all what I thought I was going to be listening to, even though it's exactly how you would describe it.
You just described my favorite genre.
That's right. Me too. And the last question I had on this, and this is not necessarily an implication or even a controversy, but it really raises the question of, is this ability to visualize imagery and kind of conjure it up in your mind's eye, is that something that is learned? And how would you know? And if it is something that's learned, could it be something that is lost? And could it be regained again? Or maybe someone who is at, the point in their life when they're adult and they are having this experience of having aphantasia, could they be able to learn to visualize things?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, has there been medically induced aphantasia?
Good segue. All right. So actually, one of the reasons that this research ever even got kicked off was this study, and they use a pseudonym, and I saw different pseudonyms, and so we're going to call this person John. So this person, John, he was an older gentleman, and he had a procedure, some kind of surgery done to treat some heart problems that he was having.
Okay.
So some kind of coronary artery heart surgery thing.
Okay.
After the surgery, he reported that he was no longer able to visualize things.
Huh.
It was really kind of funny in the stories that I read that it was every day he walked around all day imagining these things. And I'm like, man, this is like, it sounds like a crazy person, like practically hallucinating.
Or a very creative person.
Yeah, or very creative, but they're just not ever in the real world. But I think they was just using hyperbole to try and sell the story.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. That's a lot of strategies used like that to keep clickbait rolling. Yes,
totally. And so anyway, the way that it was described is this gentleman had lived his whole life, had never had any issues with this, and then he had this heart surgery, and afterward, for some reason, was unable to visualize things. And so what's important about this is that this gives us a comparison for the first time, because most of these people who describe themselves as having aphantasia don't have the experience of losing it or gaining something when they didn't have it. But instead we have this person who very explicitly could say that he did have that experience of being able to visualize things, and then all of a sudden was unable to do so. That's very curious, and that, that is a lot more evidence, I think, in favor of what might be going on here, and gives us something to sort of look at to just describe it a little bit more objectively.
Yeah. So it still gives us the issue, though, of there was no baseline measure beforehand, right? It's just his verbal reports.
Right. Yeah.
So we keep getting hit with this verbal report.
Yeah, because we don't actually
really difficult.
Even though he had the experience of being able to describe things visually, we weren't measuring that. We weren't testing it. And it makes sense. You're not just go out in the world and test people for this and then hope that they have to get open heart surgery that results in them losing this ability.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying I want that to happen. I'm just saying that's an unrealistic way to approach this.
Do we know if he ever relearned to visualize?
As far as I know, he didn't, but I didn't see any follow-ups. I actually had a hard time finding a lot of details on this.
Okay.
But what was interesting is they did want to look at this neurologically, because, of course, as soon as they heard about this, people were like, whoa, we need to study this, which is great. That's how science works.
Yeah.
And so they, of course, tried to do an fMRI, and we talked about that.
Yep.
Which means that they were using statistical packages to analyze thousands of tiny voxels.
Episode 5, if I remember.
Could be. I don't recall. It was early. And what they did is they, when they had him looking at pictures of people that he knew, they saw that he was able to easily identify people from their pictures. But then when he asked him to imagine faces of people that he knew when they were looking at this fMRI, the part of his brain that was associated with facial recognition was far weaker than when he was actually looking at a picture. I assume it was also weaker than anybody who was imagining and not just looking at a picture, but I don't know. I just didn't see that in the description of this. I had, like I said, had a hard time finding good details.
Yeah.
So this is, again, a lot more solid evidence of there's an effect out there. We don't entirely know what's going on, but it's there. The people are having this experience. In terms of this as a research study, although we do have that pre and post comparison, we didn't actually get that baseline, as you said. And the other thing is, this is one person, and we don't really have an experimental condition or a control condition or a baseline condition.
Yeah.
We really just have a post condition.
Yeah.
And so what sometimes is described as having an A phase and a B phase, where you have your baseline comparison and then your experimental comparison. This seems to only have the B phase, which isn't even really an experiment. It was just a thing that happened. And so it lacks the ability to have a lot of control, although it has the advantage of being able to have a lot of detail about his experience, which is kind of an advantage of a case study.
Yeah.
Yes, we are pre-recording these ad breaks. Well, maybe retroactively recording these ad breaks. Anyway, non sequitur, insert ads. And let's get back to that discussion.
Okay, so let us consider this in terms of some of the other philosophies of psychology.
All right, so this is kind of my take on this in general. I'm going to kind of semi-logic through this. Catch me if I make any big errors, okay?
Okay.
So memory has to do with these cues, as we've talked about. There's a lot of different cues that are out there. You mentioned these, the different senses. Any of those can be a cue to stimulate and trigger different memories or whatnot. So there's that. Now, because of this area, they call it an area of stimulus control. It's just kind of what influences us and under what circumstances, and can you teach and those sort of things, right? So I'm talking about the literature of teaching, learning, like all of this.
Okay.
And because of that, I don't want to say that anything's impossible. So like I've learned that there's a lot of things you can teach under certain conditions in which someone isn't learning things. That if you go in and look at your practices, you actually can teach certain things. So this is likely a thing that's being experienced. I want to just like come out with that. But the question is, to what degree is it being experienced, and can it be influenced at all?
I think it's a good question. It also reminds me of when you were talking about the person who was recommending using Memory Palace to try and teach visualization.
Exactly. Yeah. Like they're in line with like my view, I guess, and the view I kind of orient to when I look at these sort of things. And I would say theoretically, it appears that it could be influenced, as it falls under the same area of large, broad areas of learning and teaching and relearning as well.
Mm-hmm.
And those sort of areas. And this has actually been demonstrated, like that you can teach on just about every area of life.
A surprisingly large number of things.
Single cell organisms, sponges, all included, all the way up to extremely complex repertoires with humans or animals, right? So I think it kind of brings us back to this thing where like I resonate with the personal side and the experience of it, and cannot judge on that. We can only ask these sort of questions like we were in a scientific way.
Right.
But we have to look at these at an individual level and actually test whether or not what's going on here.
Sure.
I mean, that's it.
I agree.
So with that empirical question kind of aside, we provided some other questions that are important too, to get kind of for the skeptical listeners, I would say. So things like when you're saying like, can you not visualize your car or your house? Like those are very interesting to me. I didn't think of them beforehand. And it's just like, I need to chew on that sort of stuff more. So I hope listeners do that.
Okay. So there's some quotes from people who describe themselves as having aphantasia. The first quote I'm going to read is from a skeptic who does not believe in such a thing. And then I think you also had a quote from someone who described themselves as having aphantasia. Is that correct?
Unsure. He's definitely a supporter of the
community.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one that I had, it goes like this. What does a person mean when he closes his eyes or ear, figuratively speaking, and says, I see the house where I was born, the trundle bed in my mother's room where I used to sleep. I can even see my mother as she comes to tuck me in, and I can even hear her voice as she softly says good night. Touching, of course, but sheer bunk. We are merely dramatizing. The behaviorist finds no proof and imagery in all this. We have put these things in words long, long ago, and we consistently rehearse those scenes verbally whenever the occasion arises. And so that was said by John B. Watson, the infamous John B. Watson.
Yeah, he's well known.
Yeah, and I had a hard time tracking down the citation, but I did find that it was in 1932, and I believe it was in a book. So that obviously takes the sort of skeptical angle of this isn't a real thing, or at least it's not visual imagery, it's something else, and people aren't having an experience. That's my read on it anyway.
Yeah.
He's just saying like we're being dramatic.
Yeah. He's been quoted out of context, even quoting him kind of in context here. I mean, he's pretty blunt with the calling it out as sheer bunk.
Yeah, he is. I did find another one that I think was interesting from someone who described themselves as having aphantasia. And this is someone who said that they had like total aphantasia. And that's something where I alluded to the fact that some people might have aphantasia for particular senses. So someone might describe themselves or have the experience of having aphantasia just for visual imagery, while someone else might have it just for auditory, I guess, experiences.
Yeah.
So those are like, I guess there's a category of like partial aphantasia versus total aphantasia. So this person said that she had total aphantasia, and she said, quote, when I try to picture things, I might see some flashes of light, but nothing voluntary, end quote. And so she's basically talking about her experience of when she tries to imagine things, that she kind of gets some visuals, something that's happening, but it's not really the image itself. And so I think it's kind of interesting. Just had a direct quotation from someone who experienced that.
Yeah. So I was digging in on Aphantasia. It's a website. It's aphant.asia.
Clever.
Yes, very clever. And there's a gentleman, Thomas Broad, and I'm going to read his quote now real quick. He said, in my opinion, a good way to approach any question that relates to the subjective experiences of aphantasia is not to ask how they feel different, but to ask why others seem different to them. That may seem like asking the same question, but it forces the individual not to reflect on what they experience, but to reflect on the understanding of how they perceive others' ability to visualize. Don't know if there's any validity into that, or if it adds anything to what we've been talking about.
I think it's an interesting perspective. And I think he actually is also sort of speaking to when I said, it makes me wonder if part of this is how they react to instructions and, I guess, verbal descriptions of things.
Yeah. And he goes on to continue to say, we know we are different. We can't visualize or form any synthesized sensory experience in our mind. However, to deepen our understanding, we must understand how we differ from the general public. And I think that's a great place for the community to be sitting.
Yeah.
Like they're trying to understand the situation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like it's the sort of curiosity and also we don't know.
Yeah.
It's I think the openness to learn more.
Yeah. So I wanted to, we both found this, but point out the resource that it's out there, and anything from like the kind of scientific perspective. Like I'm always interested to see people writing about trying to understand these things, especially the ones that are experiencing it, as he talks about.
Totally. Yeah. So I guess we can kind of wrap this up and just reiterate the point that we're not trying to take away the experience from people who have this, and this is part of their experience and their lives and that sort of thing. Whatever they are experiencing is at least real. It's real for them. It's real for whatever is going on for them. And it's possible that this just needs that better research. This is pretty new in terms of being described scientifically.
Extremely new.
Yeah. Like one of the newest things I've ever heard of. And so, more research means better understanding of what this event is.
For sure.
I think the good neurology research and perception research is going to be some of the more illuminating stuff that we'll see. And the purpose of this episode was really just to be able to describe what this thing is and some of the implications of it. So we're sorry if it sounds like we're criticizing those people. We really absolutely don't mean to be doing that. It's just trying to take this, what is going on here? What are the implications? Where has the science been so far, and how could it be better? Like that was sort of why I wanted to tackle this. And so, although perhaps frustrating, this condition does not appear to result in impairments that really reduce one's ability to function or have a high quality of life. There are people who are in this community that have this experience of aphantasia who are very successful, and they seem to be doing very well. And they are very creative people as well that I've heard of. I'm not going to call any of them out, but I did read some names on there that I thought was interesting, that there were some kind of high profile people that were on this list. And for myself, and I'm really curious about this for you too, but based on all the research I did on this, I can't even tell whether or not I have aphantasia.
Yeah.
And again, like I'm inclined to believe that I don't, but I can't really tell based on the description of it.
I kind of went the other way, like talking and researching this.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, man, do I have that? Like,
right.
Because I rely so much on like visual aids all the time.
Sure.
I've got minutes, hours of videos a day, pictures all over the place, to-do notes everywhere. And it's just because that's how I get stuff done. And that's
totally,
how I recall, remember, and kind of relive things, or at least the details.
Right. Even with this, like the binocular rivalry test, I don't know that would necessarily convince me, because again, that's looking at how my visual processing is working and not necessarily how I'm verbally constructing that mental image.
Yeah.
And I feel like I can imagine things pretty vividly, but I don't see pictures. I don't see anything even remotely like a picture. I can imagine it in such a way that I can describe it really well. And I've done the memory palace exercise before, and it's like I have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah.
Living in that space, but like there's no flashes, there's no images, there's no anything.
Yeah.
Even though I can sort of behave as I can pretend as if I was having that experience. So I just can't tell whether or not, based on this description, I would fall in that category, and maybe I just need to get tested. But yeah, so that was kind of my experience with that. And then I think the last thing, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but looking at this from sort of the neurological perspective, like no one can actually visualize things in terms of seeing an image with your eyes closed or having an experience without having the sensory input, because you know that sensory organ of yours is not receiving the stimulation that
the majority of, at least,
right,
stimulation.
So if I could close my ears and imagine I'm hearing music, and I can like sort of hear music in my head and that sort of thing. I can close my eyes and imagine that I'm seeing something, but there's no picture that actually shows up. I'm not receiving any auditory or visual stimulation in those circumstances. Our brain and our mind, they just don't work like that. They don't create stimuli out of nothing. But what we can do is we can have our verbal behavior, our language around this, and we can act with our language as if those things were real. And it's one of the great benefits and downfalls of having language is the fact that we can do this thing. So if there's anyone who, again, this is my experience with this, I guess. I don't want to try and tell people they're not having this experience, but when I look at this, because I can't visualize things, at least in the sense that I'm not seeing pictures, I was not inclined to say that I have aphantasia, and I'm not now, but I also am not having that visual experience. So I just don't know. Maybe there are people out there who are like really concerned, and maybe you should get tested as well. I just can't tell.
Yeah, same here.
So yeah, I think as we said before, if you have any thoughts on this, if you have the experience, we'd love to hear from you. We'd be more than happy to share your story on the podcast. Reach out to us via email. Also, if you're curious about checking out, there's a community of people, as Ryan stated. The website for this is Aphant, so APHANT.Asia, and there's a group of people who have this experience. And as we said, they seem to approach this from this. They're curious, they want to know more about this, and they want to support each other, and I think that's great.
Okay, so that was our discussion on aphantasia. And I think, there has been some updated research. And there's also, I feel like I just wanted to revisit some of those points and just maybe say them again or a little bit differently, or try and, I think, continue to convey. I think not much has really changed in my understanding of this since then, but we do want to get into the research. Now,
sure.
One of the things that I found is, and I pulled a lot of this, I'm trying to be as charitable as I can to the aphantasia community and to the resources that they have. And so I pulled a lot of today's discussion directly from an aphantasia website, right?
Right.
And I'm really trying to characterize their position as charitably and accurately as I possibly can. And as I say in the episode, I think where this comes down to is I can't even tell whether I have aphantasia based on the way that this sort of quiz and the test is set up. So anyway, as I was saying, recent research, one of the things that they point out, and again, I pulled this from the Aphantasia website, in looking at evidence for this and maybe an explanation of it, trying to understand it, they might turn to some tests that are mental visual imagery tests. And there's this one that's called the Vandenberg mental rotation test, sometimes just called the visual mental rotation test, or VMRT is how it's summarized. And in this test, what happens is I think there's 24 questions, and in each question, it's not really a question. It's like individual test items, if you will. But in each one, essentially you get this shape that is made up of 3D cubes stacked in some orientation. And then there are 4 pictures that look very much like that stack of 3D cubes, but rotated in a different orientation. And the person who's taking the test needs to select the 2 of the 4 pictures that are the correctly rotated version of that sample picture that they start with, right?
Sure.
And so they're just trying to discern the matching image that's just rotated a different way. And so essentially what people were saying is if you can't visually rotate, if you can't see things in your mind, then you can't visually rotate these images such that you'd be able to accurately identify which ones matched. Okay.
Right.
And so the question is, can people with aphantasia even do this test? And the answer is yes, they can do the test. And not only can they do the test, but in some conditions, they did even better than the people who are not described as aphantasics in solving this test.
Right. So basically, the test that to prove that you have aphantasia tells you nothing, because it doesn't tell you that you have it, because people with aphantasia can do it.
Well, and it's not even to prove that you have aphantasia, but they were sort of saying, can we repurpose this test to evaluate the extent to which people with aphantasia can perform on similar, because this often shows up in IQ tests too. And I think that the advocates are trying to make the case that we can do all these important things too. We're not bad at thinking, is I think where they're coming from.
Maybe that's a fair way to dispel some stuff. Now, there are a couple assumptions from aphantasia.com that are worth unpacking. And this is kind of I guess the idea, sometimes people think that this is what people with aphantasia experience, right?
Yeah, and this has to do specifically with the assumptions that someone with aphantasia won't be able to do this visual mental rotation test.
Right. So assumption 1, or as they label A1, is that the quasi-perceptual experience is essential for the visualizer's strategy.
Assumption 2 is that the visualizer's strategy to solve this test is the only viable strategy for the task.
And then assumption 3, which is labeled as A3, is that aphantasics cannot visualize. That's what they're basically saying. So at this point in time, the perceptual experience is essential for a visualizer for the strategy. The visualizer strategy can only be viable to complete the task. Aphantasics cannot visualize. So as a result, aphantasics cannot actually use visualizer strategies. So that's kind of what the conclusion is with all 3 of those assumptions in place.
So that one specifically sort of follows from the A1, the quasi-perceptual experience is critical, and A3, the aphantasics can't visualize. And from those assumptions, you also get a second conclusion, which is that aphantasics cannot solve the task.
Right.
And so you have to have those assumptions to draw those conclusions is sort of where they're coming from on this discussion.
Right. They also came up with this idea, this weak rejection, which is that there's only one way, or there's not only one way to solve this, and there are other strategies, and this actually in itself negates conclusion 2, which this basically says you don't need that visual strategy to be able to solve these problems.
Right. So that's what they call the weak rejection of this sort of hypothesis. And then they have what they call the strong rejection. And this is what the case that they're making is that not only can aphantasics solve this without using a visualization strategy, but people who aren't aphantasic or that don't have aphantasia may also not be even using a visualizing strategy to solve it. And so that's sort of where they're coming from on this idea of that's why aphantasics can solve this, is that assuming that the visual mental rotation test is a good one is a problem by itself because you may not need to do any visual mental imagery to solve it. And I think that on that point, they are completely right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that makes perfect sense is that when you have to know when you have these tests that there are that humans are really complex and interesting creatures, right? And their neurological processes are so complex and so fantastic that they will find a way to solve problems beyond a singular path.
Right.
So it makes sense that like whether you have aphantasia or not doesn't matter. Like there is a way to solve it outside of having or not having that diagnosis.
And it's possible that referring to this test as a possible way to assess aphantasia was almost like a bad faith argument in the first place, because if you look at the test, you really are just visually matching an item to another item.
Right.
There's no reason to believe that you have to be able to mentally rotate that image to be able to solve this.
Right.
Although a lot of, I think, IQ tests would suggest a contrasting view with that one. But I think you can easily just look for, can I match this point to this point on this shape such that I can adequately say this is the same shape, just rotated a different direction. And to that, you don't need a visualization strategy. So I mean, honestly, if going into this from the position I had in the original version of this episode, that is the point I would also make, right? Is that I completely agree. I think that people are not using a visualization strategy to solve that. Also, I mean, aside from the fact that they're looking at pictures, they are using their eyes. But anyway, as another quick update, the famous author John Green is now discovered aphantasia and has joined the aphantasic community. So another member in the ranks, I guess.
There you go.
Okay, so, and we talk about this in the episode, but again, I think it's worth unpacking and talking through the actual sort of just trying to really objectively look at the scenario in which you try and determine to the extent to which someone can visualize something in their mind. Okay. And so let's break down the steps of what happens in this general test of trying to ask someone to visualize something.
Right. So the first thing is you ask somebody to imagine a thing when that thing is not present. So imagine an apple or imagine a book and say, it's not here, but think about that thing.
Yeah, try and see a book in your mind. And person A says, I can't see anything.
Right.
I know what a book is intellectually. I could describe the features of a book, but I do not see a book in my mind, is what that person says.
Right. And then person B says, yes, I can see that. I can visualize that. I can picture the book in my mind, the textures, the cover of the book, the structure, all of that stuff.
Okay, so far we've had someone says, imagine something. Someone says, I can't. And the other one says, I can. Those are just the things that have happened so far. Both the people, person A and person B, are responding to a language cue. Imagine thing X.
Right.
Not a tangible thing. They're not actually looking at a picture. They didn't look at a picture and then take the picture away. At no point was a tangible visual image there. They just got language thrown at them, and then they tried to behave with respect to that language. One of them says they can do so effectively. The other one says they cannot.
Right. So in this space, neither of them are responding to anything visually. And that is ultimately the issue is they're responding to a language cue, not that tangible thing. So all this says is that, when we start kind of asking the question of how this gets tested and how people evaluate this, it's all under these language cues, and it's all under words. It's all under verbal behavior.
And what power can words have to evoke visualization? Objectively, none whatsoever. Words cannot conjure images just out of thin air into existence. Right? Now, can you behave with respect to the quality of a thing described, assuming you and the speaker have a shared language? Yeah. Yes.
Right.
True of aphantasics and not. It goes back to the VMRT test. And also like these ones where they say, imagine a thing. Can you, assuming that we understand the reference of this language, can we behave with respect to the imagined thing? Whether or not you close your eyes and you see an apple in front of you, or you say that you see an apple in front of you, can you behave? Can you like describe an apple? Right. Can you imagine what it would be like if there was an apple, even though you don't actually physically see it?
Right.
Yes, for both people on this condition. And I think that the aphantasia community would say yes as well. They sort of say intellectually, we are responding to the properties of a thing we understand intellectually. We just don't see it in our mind.
Right.
And that kind of brings us back to the original point we made in this episode, which is nobody does. Everybody who says that they can is essentially they're interpreting the question of, can you visualize this as, can I behave with respect to the thing that's not there? And they say yes.
Right.
And the people who are interpreting it more literally of imagine an apple in front of you, they're like, I don't see an apple in front of me. They're like, yes, got that. Imagine it's there.
Right.
They're like, no, I don't see it. And like, yep, you're not going to see it because it doesn't exist. I want you to behave as if it were there. And they're like, okay, I mean, I can do that part. And so essentially it's just interpreting again, I don't want to come out of this sounding like I'm trying to poo-poo this whole community and say that I know what's going on in their minds. I don't know what's going on in the minds of people who say that they can visualize things. I don't know what's going on in the minds of the people who say that they can't. But what we do know is both of them can respond to the abstracted features of a thing as described by language regardless. And they kind of seem to do so pretty equally.
Absolutely. So I think when it comes to some of the processes and kind of understanding the brains of the situation, kind of like some of the discussions, there's a study done in 2021 by Milton et al., and they looked at a recall task and fMRIs. Now, people reporting higher visualization did better on recall tasks than had more activation in what they described as the, quote, visual network. Our question to that is, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, like, essentially what they're saying is, like, parts of the brain that could be associated with visual processing information, because they didn't even say which parts of the brain. They just said visual network.
Right.
It seemed like there was more activity generally going on for those people who were described as having hyperphantasia, not even just normal, like not on this, the sort of in the middle of the spectrum, I suppose. But people who are like have a vivid, they report having vivid visual mental imagery. They did sort of show up slightly better on that. They did show up slightly better on recall. So that I think is something to consider. And if I were to say to you and Shane, if I were to give you instructions in Mandarin to visualize a thing, the likelihood of you being able to do that is basically zero because you don't speak Mandarin, right?
Right.
At least not yet.
As far as I know.
So what I'm going with that is that the words that I could use, say, visualize an apple, or think of a picture of your house or something like that, you're responding to words that you have learned. Okay.
Right.
And our brains are shaped by our experiences, by our language, by our shared language, by our social environment as we go through life. And so if we think about that, then the idea of visualizing very much is related to learning, because we're simply talking about responding to language cues, right? And you can only get that from having experience with the language. So if the question is like, is this a learned thing? Almost certainly. How could it not be? If it was unrelated to language and the development of arbitrary language, then our brains should do it regardless of language. And we have no evidence that they do or don't. Like, we don't have evidence that our brains like just conjure images in sans language, or that they don't conjure images sans language, in terms of the fact that they're just hypothetical mental things, right?
Right.
It has to be a thing that's learned. And that then kind of implies it's just how you're responding to words that ask you to visualize something, and not anything mental that is actually an image or not.
Right. So there's a really great quote from the advocate group from somebody called Arcangeli.
That's how, or Arcangeli maybe.
Or Arcangeli. So this is the quote. Intuitively, it may seem that we cannot have a normal life without the possession of imaginative abilities. Yet, aphantasics do not seem to be much affected by their condition. End quote. And that's directly from the advocates. That's saying basically there's an assumption that people who can't imagine or visualize or have that experience, there's an assumption that they can't have a quote unquote normal life. But for the most part, it doesn't seem like, and according to folks that experience it or from folks that are advocates for it, doesn't seem like there's much of an effect. There's no deficit in thinking or completing tasks or anything like that. There's not really any sort of disparity in those spaces.
Yeah, and I think that essentially they're trying to come from the place of like, don't think that we are bad at cognitive tasks just because we can't imagine things.
Right.
And I have a response to that, and where I think the implication of this is, and I think we do need to take one more quick ad break. Okay, so as we're saying, the idea here being that like people who have aphantasia can live these totally normal lives, right? And so that I think there's a big wormhole discussion that is not for today's episode, because this is just a nostalgia release, and I think that I do want to unpack this more. And we have actually talked about this a bit. We had a whole episode called Diagnosing Mental Health Problems that I think got into this a bit, and we've talked about this in various diagnoses. And I'm going to keep hitting this point until the world changes, because there's always the question of what is the point of a diagnosis? What is the point?
Right.
What is the purpose of a diagnosis like this? Because I think what some people will say is, for most diagnoses, let's go to the medical field. The point is that it suggests that there is a treatment that is needed because this is a problem that will have adverse outcomes, and it often will even prescribe what that treatment is. That's what a diagnostic system is meant for.
Right.
Here's the problem, which means here is a potential solution. If you run diagnostics on your car, like something's going wrong with your car, it is identifying the problem to identify a possible solution.
Right.
That's the point of most of the medical model. So in this situation, we have a problem that's not a problem, that doesn't entail a solution. So what is the actual point of labeling it?
Right. From like a practical standpoint, you've got a community that's telling you, and that's not to say that people aren't directly impacted by this, but you've got a community and advocates and like information sites that are saying it's not really a problem. Like, it's just a different way of thinking about things. And not even a different way of thinking about things. It's a different experience that people are having. And so, not that the experiences aren't valid, not that people,
right.
like, because again, I'm not in those heads either, but it doesn't seem to lead anywhere, or it seems just that it only gives a little bit of information and doesn't give much more than that.
Yeah, and arguably, I think it's more a misunderstanding than it is in any way informative about anything.
Right.
I think some people might say, well, it's nice to know that there's just a name for what I have. First of all, okay.
Right.
But the thing is, like, everybody has their own individual experiences through life. And they've kind of got their own stuff going on, their own unique perspective where they are situated in the evolution of humankind. They will have their own sort of unique evolution that will be its own point in time, and no one else will ever be that person. No one else has ever been that person. And so, like, I have Abraham syndrome, right? If you want to give it a name,
Sure.
It's just kind of who you are, I guess. And it's like people want to like be called something. I'm like, we don't need a name for it because it doesn't affect anything. Like,
right.
you're just you coming at it from whatever experience you're having. And that is true of everyone who has ever lived or ever will. So like coming up with names for these things, like let's arbitrarily categorize this thing and give it a name because fun. I'm like, I don't see any practical utility in this.
Sure.
And so that's, I don't know. And I'm sort of like, even if that, I'm like, I don't think it's worth spending the time. I make so many people mad here, but I'm like, it's not worth spending the time even discussing whether it's point naming these experiences. We could just keep subdividing them infinitely. Like, this person's got Abraham version aphantasia, and you've got Shane version aphantasia, and our groups just get smaller and smaller and smaller because we can just label anything we want when it's not linked to any objective criteria. And so it's like, again, I'm just trying to come back to the point of like, this does not seem to have a reason to exist. And that's the part that confuses me the most about it, is like, why? And so I think this brings me back around. I'm sorry, I've been talking for so long, but
no, you're good.
It brings me back to a thing that I wanted to say, which I said in the episode, which is that before learning about aphantasia, if someone asked me to visualize something, I would have said, I definitely can. And if you say like, visualize an apple, it's like, okay, I'm visualizing an apple. And then I learn about this and I'm like, well, I don't actually see an apple. I just know how to behave with respect to the visual properties of an apple.
Right.
And that makes me think that, again, the main point is that nobody is visualizing. Everybody is doing some version of behave with respect to imagery of an apple.
Right.
Because the more and more people think, like, if we push people hard enough, nobody, I think, or not nobody, because everybody's going to say random stuff to stand out from the crowd. But like, if you push people hard enough, I think we're going to find that everyone, or most people who are going to engage with this authentically, will say, well, no, I don't actually see anything. My visual field is not occluded by this mental image you forced me to conjure, so I now can no longer walk forward because apple's just in my field of view. Thanks, jerk. Now I can't get around. You made me think of an apple, and now all I can see is a giant apple that blocks everything I do. I'm like,
sure.
Nobody does that because nothing actually pops. Like, we don't have a projector in our mind. We don't have a screen on which that projector sends its image in our mind. We don't have eyes inside of our brain hole looking at images that are somehow being manufactured. It's all arbitrary and hypothetical. And so, again, it just brings me back to, I don't think anybody's visualizing, and what is the f***ing point?
I couldn't have summed it better myself. I did want to share, I think this is probably the best time to share.
Okay.
I don't have aphantasia, but I did recently go to the doctor and I was diagnosed with Abraham syndrome.
I'm sorry, that's terminal.
Now I'm vegan and I really, really, really like Between the Bear to Me. So...
So anyway, I'm really, really sorry if I pissed a bunch of people off. I just keep thinking about this and wondering, I'm like, why are we still having this conversation? Like, nothing has actually changed in the world about this, because essentially what we have is a disagreement about how we interpret the request to imagine something.
Right.
Some people taking it very literally, like, no, but I can't see it. And some people taking it more abstractly, thinking, yes, I can. And we don't have any evidence one way or the other that they are or are not doing that. And in the episode, I gave an example of, like, imagine your name written backwards. If you can see it, I could ask you about any point in your name and you'd be able to give me the answer right away. And Shane backward, what's the third letter? Too late. Like, you should be able to tell me that if you were looking at a picture of it, right?
It took me a second. I couldn't even tell you. I don't even know how to spell my name.
I mean, and if you took a second to think about it, you would just reverse it, think backward, and you land on the right letter. But so would someone who has aphantasia, because they can do the same tasks, because that is not, that's a language task, right? So anyway, again, I really do want to be advocates for communities. I want to support people who have whatever diagnosis that they have. And I think it's also just worth understanding where it comes from in this position of thinking, like, if aphantasia is a thing, then humans got it. It's being a human.
Right.
And if it's not a thing, then humans got that too.
Right. Yeah, there you go. I think that's fair. That's a fair place to land, for sure.
All right, that was so much. If you are still around and you're not angrily writing hate mail to us or sending us poop packages in the mail, then thank you for being here. I hope that you got something out of this conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and join us in this today. If you would like to support us, I hope, please feel free to come over and join us on Patreon. If you do, you will get access to behind the scenes stuff and all this kind of bonus content and all that sort of thing. And we really appreciate the team of people who have really helped us do this podcast for so long. And that includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all very much.
Love y'all.
Also, thanks to my team of people who helped me make this podcast. Shane, thank you for recording with me today.
Anytime.
Shane and I do writing and fact-checking. Our audio production comes from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. You can also leave us a rating and review. You can pick up some merch. You can subscribe. You can tell somebody about our podcast. All those are the ways that you can support us. Is there anything that I'm missing or anything you'd like to add before we get to recommendations?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, let's do recommending some things.
Recommendations.
So I am going to recommend a tattoo studio. I might have recommended this tattoo studio before because we did, in October, we did Friday the 13th tattoos, and I thought that was really fun. But I just got tattooed at this place last night, and it is called Electric Shark Tattoo out of Port Orange, Florida. The guy that runs the shop, his name is Richard. It's just him and his other tattoo artist, Maya, and they both do incredible work. And actually, Richard's super interesting. He also machines his own tattoo machines. Like, he has invented a style of tattoo machine that works really well, to the point where my tattoo from last night has not bled since I got it.
Wow.
Really strange and really interesting, and it's a weird experience, but it's really great. And so, big, strong recommend to check out Electric Shark Tattoo out of Port Orange.
Cool. All right. Next time you're in Port Orange and looking for some ink, you know where to go.
Yeah, come hang out for Bike Week or Race Week or whatever it is you're here for.
I am recommending a company. They're either called Cloud Puncher Games or Project Ironside. I'm not totally sure, but this is a company that manufactures accessories for gaming type things, for tabletop games. And so I recently purchased one of their gaming tables. What I like about them is that it's designed to be very modular. You can kind of set it up in several different orientations. So there's like a conversion to make it coffee table height or regular table height or extra long or extra wide or just a small extension, or have like put a top on it so that, like, because the games are usually a little bit low, so you can sort of play the game in the table and then cover it with a top so then it looks like a normal table. Anyway, they also do game shelves and like some accessory pieces that are all sort of these unique twist inventions that they sort of came up with. And I was really impressed with the quality of the table that I got. So if you're interested in tabletop type accessories, I put on here the Ironside game table, but I think that on that website has links to their other projects that they've done as well.
I love that. I'm looking at it right now. There's some cool stuff on here.
Yeah, they've got some pretty neat products, and they're very reasonably priced. The reason that I actually I decided to purchase this is because it was like a fraction of what I normally see these things cost. So it's a little company. They're pretty small, but hopefully if a lot of people like what they're doing and want to support them, then they'll be able to grow, and I like what they're doing. So yeah.
And they even have cup holders.
They do have cup holders, yeah.
I love that.
Okay, so if you'd like to tell us about Aphantasia, something that we got wrong, something that we got right, if you want to throw some support our way and be like, yes, I back up what you're saying, I've seen the light, metaphorically speaking, you can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media platforms. And you can also tell us about game tables or tattoo places that you like. And if we would like to share your email with others, then we'll read it as part of a listener mail on an episode. And that can be a thing that happens. So anyway, this has become very long. Anything that you would like to add or anything that we should do before we wrap up today?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. That was a weird way for me to phrase that question, but I got nothing left. So this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.